Alright guys, recently getting home. I'm actually going to be using my headset this time, so hopefully it should be a lot more clear. What I'm doing here is actually a deck tech on a deck I put together, kind of inspired off a question that came from one of my readers on my PRMTGO content. And it involved this card right here, Realms Uncharted. What Realms Uncharted does, essentially, it is gifts ungiven for lands, so you can read the text there. It basically says, choose 4 lands after targeting your opponent. They'll choose 2 of those and put the chosen cards in your graveyard, put the rest in your hand. So it's automatically a 2-for-1, given it is for lands, but if you're playing a lands matters deck, I think this card can be extremely broken. So what I'm going to do is kind of run through this deck, and we'll eventually put it into its curve, so you can see how the deck actually curves out. But I think on a deck like this, which is essentially a combo control deck, it tends to be more relevant to sort cards by purpose, so you can clearly see how the deck functions. So the first pile that we have on the far left is essentially just our mana sources. Kind of like Legacy lands, you'll see we do run a Mox Diamond in this because we run 41 lands in a 100-card deck, which, if you're unfamiliar with the format, 41 lands is an awful lot. Most players don't run that many in their decks. Some do. I think it's too many if you're trying to play like a mid-range or an aggressive deck. Even for control, like a standard like blue-white or blue-white-red control deck, I think that's probably too many. I think you can probably pare it down to 37 or 38 for even like hard control. But when you are playing a deck where lands matter, I think it's a lot easier to go to 41 because a lot of your lands are replacing spells and effects that you would typically have. What really brings this entire deck together is the card Life from the Loam, which is kind of over on its own pile here, and we'll get to eventually. But this first pile here is just pure mana. It is fetch lands and like the core of what we're using to cast our spells. You have stuff like Urborg over here, which is going to fix because we are a 4-color deck. We play every color except for white. That's not even per se correct. This could go to a 5-color deck and run Enlightened Tutor and Knight of the Reliquary to have some added power. And that may be even right because it's still a work in progress. But I kind of wanted to build a deck that utilized what I'm going to continue to call Gifts Ungiven for Lands and/or Realms Uncharted. I think this is kind of going in the right direction. So this is an initial take on the deck. So this first pile here, or the second pile here, you have our Disruption. You see Raven's Crime at the forefront. Raven's Crime with Life from the Loam basically just means that your opponent can never keep cards in hand, which means in the control mirror you just win more than likely if they haven't developed a board presence or they don't draw into a significant board presence before you can just delete their hand. So the first pile is Hand Disruption, which I think is relevant, and I include Liliana in that, and she could actually probably also be put in this pile, which is Permanent Disruption because she also can kill creatures or force your opponent to sacrifice them. The next one up is Collective Brutality. In a deck like this with 41 lands and a Life from the Loam package where you can get vast card advantage, it tends to be okay to ditch cards early to gain advantage with a card like this against aggressive style strategies, because the biggest weakness of this style of deck is going to be just a deck curving out against it and playing like, a 2-1 into a 3-1 into, whatever, another a 3-2 or something like that. That could just kill you very easily because you don't have a lot of ways to interact with that, or you do, but it's just you're slower, and you want to set up your win con so that you're not just sitting around forever and having them continue to cast 2-1s or 3-1s, etc. Continuing to move up, we have Inquisition of Kozilek, just a fine discard card that can clear the way for some of your key cards and or get rid of like an opponent's Scavenging Ooze or something like that, that could just beat you because you really are relying on Loam with this deck. Then Thoughtseize. Thoughtseize could possibly come out for Duress, just depending on matchup. I haven't boarded this deck yet, but I think Duress probably would be part of that package. Going to the next pile here, you see we have a land in this one, and this is kind of like how we dine to get after the Graveyard Matters decks. And Bojuka Bog, is not per se like only relevant in like against Reanimator or against this style of deck in the mirror, which I will show you a matchup of after we get done going through the deck. But it's also relevant against just like some fair mid-range decks. Like it can be used in combination with one of our tutor effects, which we'll get to eventually. Crop Rotation, which is somewhere in this pile, or at least it should be. And I can't really find it right now. There it is, Crop Rotation, which just says sacrifice a land, find any land in your deck. You can use it to kill a Kitchen Finks. You can use it to stop some sort of shenanigans with the graveyard. It's just a strong card, especially in a deck that can tutor for lands as heavily as this one can, and it can generally play multiple lands in a turn, so you don't really feel the pain of having to put one into play tapped. Then Scavenging Ooze. This is a fine mid-range threat, as well as life gain against aggressive decks, and it's just great in the mirror, and it disrupts value gained out of the graveyard. Deathrite Shaman, the only 1-mana ramp card, but it's really in here because it's just an extremely flexible card. It could just do a lot. One, being a clock and just being able to win the game is sometimes relevant. Probably not going to be in a deck like this, but being able to attack the opponent's graveyard for 1 mana and get value out of it, whether that's gaining life against aggressive decks, whether that's doming control decks for 2 damage, or ramping yourself into a faster win. It's all upside, and I think it's very hard to cut this card because I think it's just so flexible and good. This next pile here is just our counter magic package. I do think you want a little bit of counter magic in this style of deck. I think most of what you're worried about is actually non-creature spells, because we do have a decent amount of ways to deal with like mid-range threats. Now, I know I already said, I don't want to contradict myself, that like if an opponent goes 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, they can just beat you. And we do have tools against that, but more so, I guess what I mean is I'm not really worried about the decks that are playing like 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop, or 3-drop, 4-drop, 5-drop. That doesn't worry me as much. That's giving me a lot of time to kind of set up for how the deck is designed to win, and we'll kind of get to that when we start getting to the Loam packages and kind of how the lands can be used to win. But as you can see, we have stuff like Counter Squall, which I think is great. I cut Negate for this beauty right here because it gives incremental damage, which is not always irrelevant. And it does the same thing Negate does. And I don't think on a deck like this, with the volume of fetch lands we're playing and the amount of land matters cards, we're going to generally have a difficult time fixing. I don't think that's really the case. Counter Spell, just kind of an ubiquitous, control card, and we are, again, a combo control deck. Spell Pierce, just really good in the control mirror, whether that's going to be a lands control mirror or just a control mirror. It's just very efficient. Spell Snare. This is just a very efficient card, and it can get like cards like Tarmogoyf or Hymn to Torek. I guess I haven't seen it in a long time, but possibly Sinkhole. It can also get a timely Life from the Loam from the opponent as well, or a Stoneforge Mystic, or anything along those lines, or Thalia. There's many things it can get, and I think it's just a powerful card for the efficient rate it's coming at. Miscalculation, actually pretty decent. So I have a lot of cycling cards in this, and that's twofold. One, this is not going to work with Life from the Loam, but the cycling lands obviously work very favorably with Life from the Loam because they're giving you real cards off of Life from the Loam. It basically just says draw 3, given you're paying a lot of mana to do that, but by the time you're in that point in the game, that's going to be overpowering in the control mirror and generally just going to outvalue the mid-range decks. Miscalculation is a fine counter, and it also allows you to protect Life from the Loam. So if your opponent plays, like a Deathrite Shaman and goes to exile Life from the Loam to force you to lose life, you can just cycle Miscalculation and get it back in response, which I think is fine. It's the same with these lands that are over here in pile, whatever pile this is, the one I'm highlighting right now. So that's kind of why I like the card. I think it's just very efficient. It's decent. Then you have Mana Leak. Mana Leak is just, a great efficient rate for the effect you get off of it. And you kind of want to have some effects like this just to kind of stall the game out and allow you to set up. All right, this next pile has got a bit going on. So it's removal is how I look at it. And you could argue Glacial Chasm is not removal, but I'll talk that one first. Glacial Chasm with Life from the Loam, if you're not familiar with like the lands-based legacy combo, basically means that, if you have a card like Exploration or Fast Bond or Azusa in play, and you can play multiple lands per turn, it basically means your opponent can never do damage to you. Now, keep in mind, not being able to be damaged does not mean you can't die. You can still lose life. So life loss and damage are two different things. So for instance, I actually recently killed an opponent that had a Glacial Chasm lock on me with Deathrite Shaman because it forces the opponent to lose life, does not damage them. So whereas cards like Lightning Bolt and Red Deck Winds would have a difficult time dealing with a Glacial Chasm outside destroying it and then attacking for the win, there are options to get around it. It's not like Platinum Empyrean where once it hits the board, it's just like my life total does not change, which prevents both life loss and damage. So I look at this as kind of being a moat, and I think what it effectively does is invalidates or makes all of the creatures in board development an opponent has done or made that is intended to damage you through combat to death, makes them blank cards. It makes them just say, nothing on them. They're just pieces of cardboard at that point. So I look at it as removal, actually mass removal. So, it could possibly go into this pile right here. It's kind of like a moat is how you treat it. All right, the next one up is Cabal Pit. Cabal Pit has some obvious synergies with Life from the Loam, as we're going to generally have a decently sized graveyard. And being able to recurse this little fellow right here, especially if we have like a fast bond or exploration in play, or a Sousa, where we can play multiple lands per turn, um, and or Crucible, which is also up here, which just says, hey, we can play it from your graveyard straight up. It's just removal. So it takes care of aggro decks pretty well. You can just start knocking out their creatures at basically a free rate, which is a pretty good deal. The next one in here is, I don't even know where to move this thing. I'll just move this one down. Is Barbarian Ring, which essentially does the same thing. It does 2 damage, so as opposed to -2/-2, you just do damage off of it, which is fine. Oftentimes you don't want to tap these in the early game or mid game because you're going to be taking a beating on a deck like this against aggressive decks. But once you get to the late game, I mean, Barbarian Ring can just be a win con if you can do it enough times a turn. I mean, you can do easily 4 damage a turn with this card. The next one up is Maze of Ith, which is essentially removal for the best threat they have that does not have hexproof. So I tend to very much so like it because, it cannot tap for mana unless you have Urborg in play. It's a pretty powerful card. The next one is Tabernacle, and you could possibly put this in mass removal as well. Really, it's just a vast tempo gain. Because we run, it says 13 creatures. Really, it's 12. We do have a Dryad Arbor in the deck. But Tabernacle, just, against creature-based strategies, is going to tend to slow them down. It's basically like they're paying for propaganda every turn without even attacking, which means they're going to cast out their things slower. They're going to tend to not want to play Mana Dorks, or Mana Dorks are going to be invalidated by this card. So it can mitigate some of their speed and allow you to set up kind of more busted things. The next one is Grove of Burned Willows, which really on its own doesn't do what this espoused pile is supposed to do, which is removal. But with Punishing Fire, which is not an uncommon thing. Actually, I assembled this, but unfortunately had the Bajuka Bog kill one half of it in the game I'm going to show you with this deck. But once you get this recursion online, this is just a ton of value. And against the white aggro decks, even against mid-range, you can use it to kind of just, eventually kill all their creatures and just knock them out of the game. The next couple, we have, Fatal Push, just very efficient, ubiquitous in Standard, Modern now. I think it even sees Legacy play. I've seen it in 1 or 2 Vintage decks. They were kind of weird decks, though. Just a good removal spell, especially all the fetch lands we have. Ghastly Demise, more questionable one. We may want more mass removal than we want this card, but I'm trying it right now. I kind of enjoy it. I like the card a lot. I think it's pretty cool, and I think it's very efficient rate, and I think it'll generally be able to deal with much bigger threats than you would expect, just due to the fact that we're going to be filling our graveyard up with a lot of cards. Nature's Claim. So this is kind of some main deck tech. I think I have to be concerned about cards like Rest in Peace or any non-creature-based graveyard hoser that I can't, kill with the rest of my removal suite. So I kind of like Nature's Claim. I could go for a card like Sultai Charm, but it's a lot more expensive, and I don't really think the life gain is that relevant in this deck. I think you have to establish crushing control with it to win with it. So it doesn't really matter what life total the opponent's on. It just matters that you've limited their possibilities to the top of their deck every time, almost to null. They can't win, and they generally will just concede. So I think having an option that you can do at 1 mana is pretty good. Lightning Bolt, just it's a powerful removal spell. What can I say? There's not much to it. There's a lot to it. I mean, it's a hell of a card, but, at the end of the day, I think everyone knows Lightning Bolt. Everyone loves it. It's a great card. Very well designed card. Very powerful, though. Molten Vortex. This is kind of like some legacy lands tech. We don't run a ton of red sources, but we run enough that in combination with Life from the Loam, where you're going to have a bunch of extra lands in your hand on every turn if you want. This can do 4 to 6 damage in a turn. I mean, I think if I went through and looked at my red sources, it could probably do a lot more than that, but it'll generally be able to control the board pretty well, and or just kill your opponent unless they have a ley line of Sanctity or something in play. Next one's Abrupt Decay. It can kind of do what we were talking about as well against enchantments, kind of the reason we have Nature's Claim in here, and it's just flexible removal for stuff like Rest in Peace or whatever, just creatures even. Golgari Charm, same story, just a Swiss Army knife of a card. I'm a big fan of it, and I think in this deck it's good enough to run main because it does so much different, or it does so many different things. It can just be a one-sided Wrath in some matchups. In others, I mean, it can just get a pertinent enchantment that is stopped me from using my graveyard. Regeneration of my creatures is generally not going to be relevant because I don't have that many. However, I wouldn't say it's irrelevant because, I mean, your creatures that you have are generally going to tend to be important to your strategy, and we'll kind of cover some more of them in a little bit here. Maelstrom Pulse, just powerful removal. It just gets anything. It gets enchantments, it gets planeswalkers, just an all-around good card. Higher rate at 3 mana, which is funny to say that 3 mana is a lot, but, it is. So this next pile here is just mass removal. You have Damnation up here, which, you've probably heard of before. It's just Wrath of God, but black. And then we have Toxic Deluge, which is just a very efficient Wrath effect that gets around indestructibility, hexproof, all kinds of random stuff. Pernicious Deed, it's the Nick Fit kind of mainstay. You don't really see this in Legacy lands, but I think it's good in this deck because we're going to be running a lot less permanents, and we're going to have a lot more mana generally than our opponents due to some of the cards we'll get to in a second, which are our ramp package. And then Glacial Chasm, which we already kind of talked through, what it can do for the deck. It basically says you can never be damaged again if you have it online with Life from the Loam and then like a Fast Bond or Exploration. Or a Sousa, I suppose. Going to the next pile, it's our card advantage pile. And the first card here you see is Jace, the Mind Sculptor. Jace, not much to be said about him. If you've played Legacy, Vintage, if you've played any format with Jace, then you're probably familiar with what he can do to games, which is end them pretty quickly. Tireless Tracker's next. This card is bonkers, especially if you're playing a deck where you can play multiple lands in a turn or play lands from the graveyard zone. You just can accrue vast card advantage. Given it's a little expensive, it's 2 mana to do this two mana to draw off of it every time, but it can also just turn itself into a massive threat, which is pretty amazing. In a deck that'll be indiscriminately putting cards into the graveyard and has a decent number of removal spells and or tutors, I think Jace Vryn's Prodigy is very strong in this deck. He's the next kind of card advantage card, but really he ends up converting into whatever you need him to be because he will be used to, rip apart their hand. He'll be used to he can't be used to counter spells, but rip apart their hand, remove creature threats, maybe even mass removal, or maybe tutor. Tutor or card selection is kind of this big 19 card pile right here that I'm currently highlighting. The next card up, and this is kind of a Timmy card. I'm not sure if it's going to stay in or not. But there's actually 2 cards that do this in the deck. Horn of Greed. Horn of Greed is interesting. I think in this deck that has Fast Bond, Exploration, Azusa, and has a way to get after a lot of lands, i.e. Life in the Loam, this card is extremely powerful. 3 mana is an awful lot. I don't know if it's right for the deck. It is a unilateral effect with your opponent as well, which can be dangerous. But I think we can just exploit it so much better than our opponent that, it tends to be worth it. Like, they may draw 1 card off at a turn, but we can draw, up to 7, 8 cards. Maybe we could draw the whole deck in a turn if we had Fast Bond and certain other cards in play. Fast Bond plus Crucible in this thing, that's basically with a fetch land, good game, because you're just going to draw your whole deck at some point in time. That may be a little too Timmy, though. It is kind of narrow, so I may remove that. Titania is kind of a pure threat, but I also look at her as card advantage and ramp. Kind of in a similar vein to Horn of Greed, but a little more, reliable. She can put easily in this deck 15, maybe even 20 power into play on the turn she comes in if you're timing her up right. And really end the game almost in a turn, unless the opponent has a Wrath effect or something like that. But generally when you're playing her, you have total control over the game, and you're just using her to win. The next card is Gitrog Monster. Gitrog Monster is kind of like a secondary, but better Horn of Greed because he's also a threat. He obviously doesn't work the same way. It's when you sacrifice lands, you get to, whenever a land is put in your graveyard from anywhere, which is actually really pertinent. Then you get to activate him and draw a card. In a deck that can play lands out of the graveyard zone, having the downfall of sacrificing lands, which is what he does, on your upkeep you have to sacrifice a land, is really not a downside, especially because you can play additional lands each turn, which means you can always get ahead on lands. Sacrificing them is not per se a big deal because you're going to draw more real cards off of it, and you're probably still going to go up because we're a 41 land deck on your mana count, so you can be able to cast things on curve as needed. Plus, he's just a 6/6 Death Toucher. He's a lot of mana, but if he lasts for a turn or two, which we'll kind of show you in a game, he could just end games really fast because it's just so much card advantage. The next pile here is kind of ramp. So Fast Bond is one of the engine cards of the deck. If you get an early Fast Bond, it could just win the game. This deck could theoretically fish out on turn 1. I would have to go through and construct the hands, but I know it could with Fast Bond plus Crucible and some other stuff in here. Zurin Orb, which we'll cover in a second. There are ways to make infinite mana with this deck and not kill yourself. And basically what I'm looking at is, Zurin Orb, Crucible of Worlds, Fast Bond, and Courser of Crewfix. You couple that with a Horn of Greed effect or with a Gitrog Monster on turn 1, then you could just draw your whole deck and just win on the spot. which is kind of like one of the cool things the deck can do. I don't think it's very likely to do that. I think you're more than likely to play like a long attritional game. That's why we've kind of put some of these. We're not an all-in combo deck. We put some of these control elements in the deck so we can make the game go long, and eventually we'll be able to hit that. Hit that game state where we are able just to do like an infinite recursion of lands and develop an unbeatable board position with either Gitrog Monster drawing us our whole deck or Titania putting infinite 5/3s into play for a lethal attack. Um, the next card is Exploration. Obviously, a lot less powerful than Fast Bond, but in turn one, or even later in the game, when you're trying to use a card like Glacial Chasm, or you're trying to use some of these removal lands like Barbarian Ring or Cabal Pit in order not to go down land drops, Exploration can be very potent. Even in combination with Gitrog Monster, it can, as opposed to just staying at land parity for the turn count, you can actually go up by one turn if you have this in play. So I think it's still a great card in the deck, but it's obviously no Fast Bond. Azusa, Lost But Seeking, a little on the verge, again, kind of like Horn of Greed. But, what sold me on her over a card like Oracle of Moldiah, which I also considered for the deck, is that she's 3 mana, and, being able to play 3 lands per turn is pretty epically good. I mean, I don't think she's as good as Exploration, but she does essentially the same things that Exploration does for this deck. And you've probably seen her in Commander before. She's probably a little better there because you always know you're going to have her in your deck and be like constructed around always having her on turn 3, as long as you draw the requisite ramp to get to her. But in this deck, I think she's just fine too. Like even mid or late game, if you draw her and you have like one of these locks, these combos online, she can just exacerbate the volume of card advantage you can get off of them. And then Garruk Wildspeaker, he's kind of a good stuff card. He ramps. He keeps you alive. Realistically, you're not looking to beat down with this guy or use his -4 ability. You're looking to like either ramp yourself into something relevant, some relevant effect, or you're looking to just make 3/3s and block and just stay alive for a little bit. Probably some combination of the two, but you're probably never using the -4 ability. So he may be cut too. So like Azusa, Horn of Greed, and Garruk are kind of like cards that I'm just trying because Garruk's just a good stuff card, and I don't know if he's good enough. The next pile here is our card selection and tutors. So we'll start off with tutors. So you have Teleria West at the bottom. Because we're a land-based deck, we want to be able to find whatever land we may need. This is primarily a green deck, but it does have enough blue mana that transmuting this card is not out of the realm of possible. Being able to transmute it on an every turn basis with a card like Life from the Loam can just be backbreaking because you're finding exactly the cards you need, whether that's Ghost Quarter and Wasteland, whether that's Bazaar of Baghdad, or whether it's just a combo kill with, Dark Depths or Thespian Stage, or maybe just a Glacial Chasm to stay alive forever, or, Maze of Ith or Tabernacle to kind of blow your opponent out, or just removal options like Barbarian Ring or Cabal Pit. So the card's very potent, I think, in this list. Obviously, as it comes into play, tapped island that you can't fetch, but at the end of the day, what you're really playing it for is that transmute effect, and I think it's quite potent. The next card we've got is Worldly Tutor, which just allows me to find whatever creature I may need. Now, typically speaking, in this style of deck, I could go, for like the Big Daddy Prime Time here, but typically speaking, or like Gitrog Monster, Titania. But typically, I think, well, there's going to be 2 ways you use it. Either you're going to be using it to get a win con, which is going to be like either Gitrog or Titania, or you're going to use it to find something like Azusa, Courser of Crufix, or Ramunap Excavator, because these cards, or possibly Tireless Tracker, because these cards all allow you to, they all have specific effects that this deck is looking for, whether it's getting recursion out of your graveyard, being capable of playing more than 1 land per turn, or generating card advantage through land drops. There are a lot of situations where you want one of those effects, maybe not all of them, because you probably already have one or the other, i.e., like, if you have Loam, you already have card advantage, you don't need Tireless Tracker. But if you have Loam, you probably want the ability to play more lands, which means Azusa likely goes up in value. If you already have the ability to play a lot of lands, then you likely want, Ramunap or Tireless Tracker, so you can, get into gas, or, increase the amount of playable lands that you have available to yourself, so you can continue to use whatever advantage you already have due to an increased mana pool. So I can see it being used several ways, but really it's actually a pretty flexible card, and despite going down a card, when you use it, it tends to find you a card that will accrue you much more advantage. Trophy Mage is up next. Trophy Mage finds two things. It finds Horn of Greed as of right now, but I said it was kind of on the chopping block. But more importantly, it finds Crucible of Worlds, which is essentially like our secondary, or maybe Ramunap is our secondary Crucible of Worlds. I don't know, but it is the same effect that Ramunap has, just doesn't have a body, and it's generally a little harder to remove. But it's pretty epic level good in a deck like this, where all of my lands are doing specific things, and I can play more than one land per turn. And a lot of them, as a result of being spell lands, go to the graveyard after use, and I can recycle them to get continued card advantage out of them. The next one's Prime Time. Primeval Titan. You probably know this card. Generally speaking, when it comes into play, it's probably going to get the Dark Depths Thespian Stage combo I'm highlighting down here, but that's not always, per se true. It could get some of the spell lands, or like a Tabernacle, or even a Glacial Chasm if like I'm casting it in a time when I know I'm going to die on the next turn, my opponent's going to attack me and kill me. I could just get Glacial Chasm and then just win you the game, which is pretty sweet. So that's why he's in there. Plus, he's just a big 6/6 trampler that can just win the game on his own, which is pretty cool. The next card up is Mystical Tutor. Mystical Tutor, 9 times out of 10, is going to get Light from the Loam, or possibly Intuition, or Realms Uncharted. We kind of already talked about Realms Uncharted and Intuition, but I'll jump into them now. Intuition is generally going to get you 2 lands plus Life from the Loam. Those 2 lands could be Dark Depths and Thespian Stage. They could be Bazaar of Baghdad, because they could be Bazaar of Baghdad, Life from the Loam, and like Crucible or something like that, or some other land, maybe like Wasteland, because Life from the Loam with Bazaar of Baghdad is a pretty epic level. It basically just says like, hey, you're going to draw 2 cards. You're still going to discard 3, but if you're discarding 3 lands, you're going to draw them back again, which means you basically just tapped a land that can't produce mana without Urborg in play to draw 2 cards, which, being able to divination for essentially the cost of 1 land drop seems pretty damn good to me, especially when it's recursive and you can do it every single turn. So it's pretty powerful, I think, even though, it can lead to some awkward draws in the beginning of the game. Realms Uncharted, we kind of talked about this in the beginning, basically just says, gifts ungiven, but only for lands. So similar to Intuition, you probably get packages that include this, maybe these guys right here, maybe some of the spell lands, maybe Glacial Chasm to stay alive, maybe Maze of Ith, maybe Tabernacle. It can get four lands, any type of lands. If you have Life from the Loam in play, you're basically saying, I want to get the 4 best lands in my deck, and if you have something like Exploration, Azusa, or Fastbond, you can play them all in one turn if you have Life from the Loam as well. So I think we're really exploiting the power of this card. I think it's kind of a clunky and weird card, but, like Gifts Ungiven, if you find a way to exploit the inherent volume of card selection it gives you, and even turn that on its head and take that selection and turn it into actual advantage as well. With Life from the Loam, it's extremely powerful, especially in a deck where, we're using our lands as spells. The next up is Sylvan Scrying. Nothing too fancy here. It just finds me any land in my deck. If I need one piece of the combo, I can get it. If I want Bazaar to accrue vast advantage, I can get it. If I need a Timely Wasteland, I can get that too. Glacial Chasm, Tabernacle, whatever. And get me any land I want at the cost of 2 mana, which is pretty fair. Green Sun Zenith. This is ramp if I need it for Dryad Arbor. It can find me a hate piece like Deathrite Shaman or Scavenging Ooze, or it can just be used near the end of the game, or when I want to close the game out to find one of my win cons like Gitrog Monster Titania or Primeval Titan. So pretty powerful card there. And let me see where we at. Gamble is going to generally find Life from the Loam, because typically speaking, because we're a 41 land deck, we don't really care what we discard, or we can at least construct situations where we don't care what we discard. And if we discard the card we get, which is typically going to be Life from the Loam, we don't really care either, because we'll just draw into it and get more lands back. So pretty damn good. Crop Rotation, similar thing to Sylvan Scrying, with the exception of I have to destroy one of my lands to do it, but it is instant speed, which is powerful insurance against cards like Wasteland. It can allow you an instant speed to generate a 20/20 if you need to, or just to protect a land or get a very specific land with an effect that you need, like maybe Tabernacle just to force them to tap out, or maybe Glacial Chasm to keep yourself alive, whatever it may be. Impulse, just a strong, very powerful, I think, selection effect. It is 2 mana, but 4 cards is a lot to look through, and I think it's pretty darn powerful. The next up are just kind of your common. I'll cover the common ones. So Preordain, Scry 2, and draw a card. Great. A lot of fetch lands. Brainstorm, Lycan Legacy can act as an ancestral recall. And then Ponder, extremely powerful as well. Both Brainstorm and Ponder have been restricted in Vintage. and they just generally do what this deck wants you to do, which is find the right answer for the situation you're in the early to mid game to stay alive. Regrowth, because we indiscriminately chuck cards in the graveyard, I was kind of considering two options. One, either Regrowth or Eternal Witness. I ended up going with Regrowth because I didn't want to have more double green cards than I needed in the 3-mana spot, and Regrowth is just more efficient. I don't know if that's right or not, but I kind of like Regrowth a little better for this style of deck. The next card we have in here is my third, I like to call it my third Sylvan Library. Grim Flayer has the propensity to get very large in this deck, and he can also he can also generate literal card advantage. Typically speaking, he's generating card selection on your top deck, but because you can put lands, like all of them, into the graveyard or Life of the Loam in the graveyard, he gives you a lot more targets for Life of the Loam, which, turns into advantage at the end of the day, and is very powerful. Next up, we have Sylvan Library, just kind of an all-star, just great card selection. You can actually draw with this and get advantage, but it's a lot of life loss. We'll kind of get into how this deck stays alive here momentarily. And then last up, you have Search for Azcanta, which, kind of does the same thing that Sylvan Library does for us, with a little more upside in the late game. It allows us to ditch, land cards we don't need into the graveyard, or spells we don't need, or Life of the Loams we don't need in the graveyard, and then, eventually get them back when we're able to get Loam online, or like, a Ramunap, or, Crucible of Worlds online. One thing I didn't note with Teleria West is that it actually also acts as a tutor for Zerrin Orb. As you can see, our selection pile, which is not irrelevant, we'll kind of cover why Zerrin Orb's in the deck in a second. One of the things you'll see is that, this deck, this 19 card pile right here that just, is all selection, that I'm trying to highlight, but highlighting two piles right here. All really looks to get after this card right here. This card right here is the backbone of the deck. You want to protect it like it is your baby, because it's what allows this deck to generate crushing advantage. Can it win otherwise? Yes. Is it likely to? Not as much. But all of these cards are really designed to either get after specific pieces that let you get it, or just find it itself. So Loam is the engine, and really everything else in the deck just kind of allows it to run. Well, I guess I would say Loam and Fastbond are kind of two engines that work very synergistically together. The next card's Zerrin Orb. When you have Fastbond, Exploration, ways to return card or land cards from the graveyard, you can either gain infinite life and also make infinite mana if you you can make infinite mana. It's not hard. Like, you just tap it first, then sack it, tap it, sack it. Unless you're using like a shock land, like you should be able to make infinite mana pretty easily with Zerrin Orb and Fastbond, which is as a combo that used to be seen sometimes in Vintage. I think at one point Zerrin Orb was actually restricted in Vintage, which is kind of funny. But very powerful card. It is tutorable with Teleria West, and just kind of sweet. Like, being able to gain infinite life against an aggro deck while you're able to play infinite lands, like, seems pretty good. Crucible of Worlds, kind of already talked about it. This is kind of like an added benefit. It's not as powerful as Life from the Loam, but being able to recurse lands, especially if you're able to use some of these effects over here that I'm highlighting to do it multiple times in a turn, is extremely powerful. And when you get into like cards like Wasteland and Ghost Quarter, it can essentially mean like your opponent is going to have no lands in their deck or no lands on their board. If they want to continue to play lands when you can infinitely recurse a Ghost Quarter, eventually they'll figure out they have to stop, because you're just going to continue to blow them up. It's essentially strip mine at that point, because it'll just keep going until you've essentially done mana severance on your deck, for all of the basics if that's all you're running. Next up, you have Courser of Kruphix. Courser of Kruphix is actually interesting because Courser of Kruphix with Fastbond is actually a combo. Like, you can, once you have Courser in play, you still lose a life, but you gain one immediately following on the stack. So it basically nullifies the life loss of Fastbond. And it's just a good blocker, a decent mid-range creature, and allows a lot of card advantage, which is the biggest piece. But it also keeps you alive, which is not irrelevant in a deck like this. It's only running 13 creatures. It's just a high synergy card. Ramunap, kind of already covered him. More recursion from the graveyard is always going to be a great thing on this deck. The next pile you have here is your cycling lands, which essentially with Life from the Loam will mean that you are drawing real cards off of these cards that you have in your graveyard. So the idea being you'd spend 2 mana to get these things back, and then spend 1 or 2 mana to turn them into real cards, and then do it all again the next turn until you've sculpted the perfect hand, and have a very robust mana base to support the casting of all of it. The next pile here is just the LD pile. So, with Crucible or Ramunap or Fast Bond plus either of those, this can, either be, a very slow and drawn out wasteland lock, or it can be like, I'm going to machine gun down all of your lands, on the board this turn. Depending on what you've managed to establish as far as the lock goes. Bazaar of Baghdad, like we already talked about, is in and of itself just card selection at the cost of card advantage. But when you couple it with a card like Life in the Loam, it's essentially like, having Squee Goblin to Bob, because you can just, Life in the Loam and you're going up 2 cards. So you're essentially just tapping your Bazaar of Baghdad, which doesn't produce mana at its detriment unless you have Urborg in play. But it does divination just off of a land drop. Like, I have a land drop that every turn will divinate for me, which is pretty sweet. And then you have Dark Depths and Thespian Stage, which, if you're not familiar with that combo, what it does is puts, a 20/20 Merit Lage into play once both lands have been put into play, and you spend 2 mana tapping the Thespian Stage. So that was the deck tech. I think I'm going to cut this one off here, guys, and then I will put gameplay up as a separate file immediately following upload of this product right here. So I hope you guys enjoyed this lands, black, blue, green, red lands in the 100-card singleton format. I was kind of inspired by Michelle's question from Pure MTGO, and I wanted to build a deck around the card Realms Unbound, or what is it, Realms Uncharted, or something like that. I can never remember card names, guys. I'm sorry. I'm so bad with them. Well, I can't find it. Realms Uncharted, right here. But we'll put some gameplay up of this deck in a match we played against Player Sassoon, a German Highlander player, and also sometimes frequenter of the 100-card singleton event, the Chainsaw Massacre. So I'm going to cut it here, and I'll see you back momentarily.